The dawn broke hard over Basin Dust Haven, spilling a light the color of rust and old blood across the plains. The wind, which never truly slept here, whipped the bitter sagebrush until the air smelled of ruptured stems. At the center of this desolation, a wooden windmill groaned, a rhythmic, aching sound that was the only heartbeat of the Willow Notch Ranch. Ward McKinnon stood on his porch, the warped floorboards cool beneath his stockinged feet. He was a man carved from the same hard material as the land, his face mapped by sun and worry. Though he was not yet 30, he rolled a single brass cartridge in his palm, feeling the satisfying weight of it before slotting it into the 6th chamber of his revolver. 6 bullets. It was never enough. He pulled his boots on. The leather cracked and dried despite the grease he'd worked into them last month. Everything he owned was dying of thirst. Inside the sagging barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay dust and animal sweat. His tack hung from a peg, the bridle patched with rawhide strips stiff as old jerky, the saddle worn smooth in the seat but frayed at the stirrups. He checked the feed bin. 2 sacks of cornmeal remained, their sides slumped in, a coarse yellow powder dusting the bottom of the barrel. 2 sacks. The thought of the bank in Larkspur settled on him like a physical weight. Silas Braddock. The name tasted like alkali dust. Braddock ran the Larkspur Bank, and by extension, he ran the lives of nearly every man in the valley who relied on credit to survive the dry seasons. Ward's note was coming due. The interest, a cruel 20% compounded by the season, was a noose tightening with every sunrise. Braddock was not a man known for extensions, especially not for a rancher whose herd had dwindled to 20 head and whose best grazing land was turning to rock. Ward stepped back into the blinding copper light, his gaze sweeping the horizon. It was a habit born of isolation, scanning the endless line where the gray earth met the pale sky. A smudge of motion. He stilled, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. It was not the purposeful dust cloud of a posse or the bank's wagon. It was a single rider, and he was moving wrong. The man was slumped low over the pommel, his horse a skeletal shape, moving with a stumbling, exhausted gait. Ward moved toward the property line, his boots sinking into the loose dirt. The horse saw him and stopped, its sides heaving, ribs stark beneath its hide. As the horse stopped, the rider kept going, a boneless weight that tumbled from the saddle and hit the packed earth with a heavy, final thud. Ward ran, his caution overtaken by the sudden, violent stillness of the scene. He knelt, rolling the man over. The stranger was anonymous, his face blasted by sun and caked in grime, his beard matted with sweat and something dark. His eyes were open but saw nothing, focusing somewhere past Ward, into the sun. "Water!" the man rasped, his lips cracked and black. Ward uncorked his own canteen, lifting the man's head. The stranger was heavy, a dead weight, but Ward managed to pour a thin stream of water over his lips. Most of it ran down his chin. The man choked, his eyes fluttering, finding a sudden, desperate focus. He tried to lift his arm. Ward saw the effort, the trembling in the muscles. "Easy," Ward said. Help's a ways off. Just be still." The stranger's hand, cold and damp, fumbled at his own belt. He was trying to unhook a small leather pouch. His fingers were stiff, useless. He looked at Ward, his eyes pleading. "Please." The whisper was barely air. Ward nodded, his own hands moving to the man's belt. He unfastened the pouch and a heavy, pitted iron key that was tied to it with a leather thong. He placed them in the drifter's lap. The stranger's hand closed over Ward's wrist. The grip was shockingly cold, a damp chill that seemed to seep into Ward's own skin. It was the cold of a deep cellar, of a place the sun had never touched. Mesquite Draw. The drifter gasped, a strange, terrible energy surging through him. Do not let the railroad take Mesquite Draw." Ward frowned. "The railroad? What are you—" "The map," the man rasped, clutching Ward's hand tighter, pulling it toward the pouch. "The key. Take it." "I can't take your property," Ward said, trying to pull away from the icy grip. It is for—" The man's breath hitched, A tremor ran through him, a violent shudder that ended in a wet cough. Blood, bright and arterial, flecked his lips. His eyes widened in shock, or perhaps just recognition. "Listen," he commanded, his voice suddenly, terribly clear. "Keep my word. To June. June, who, Larkspur Crossing," the drifter whispered. His grip went slack, his hand falling away from Ward's. His head lolled back against the dirt. "Keep my word. To June." His breath left him in a long, rattling sigh. And then there was only the sound of the wind and the endless, metallic groan of the windmill. Ward stayed kneeling for a long time, the man's cold hand still resting near his own. He looked at the pouch and the key lying in the dust. He looked at the dead man's face, now peaceful, the lines of pain erased. He looked toward the distant smudge on the horizon that was Larkspur Crossing. Larkspur Crossing, June. He only knew of one June in Larkspur, June Calloway. She ran the Calloway Mercantile, the only provision store in town that didn't belong to a conglomerate. She was a widow, young but possessing an independence that unsettled men like Silas Braddock. She had, it was rumored, been a field nurse in some unnamed conflict before settling here. Now, she sold flour, beans, and bolts of calico, and 3 nights a week. She taught reading and sums to the children of miners and ranch hands by the light of kerosene lamps in the back room of her store. The town gossip, which Ward usually ignored, claimed Silas Braddock himself had proposed to her last spring, offering to merge her small mercantile with his sprawling financial interests. The town had held its breath. June Calloway, polite but firm, had refused him flat. She was returning to town soon, Ward recalled, after spending the long winter months back east settling her late husband's estate. Ward looked down at the dead man. This was not his business. He was a rancher with 2 sacks of cornmeal and a note due, but a promise made to a dying man, even a stranger, had weight. He rode the 10 miles to town, found the parson, and reported the death. They brought a wagon back. They searched the man's pockets but found nothing, no identification, no money, just worn-out clothes. Ward said nothing of the pouch or the key. They buried him in the bare patch of ground behind the small wooden chapel. The grave marked by a simple cross Ward fashioned from 2 pieces of scrap lumber. The parson said a few words over the mound of fresh, pale dirt. But Ward was the only mourner. That evening, alone in his cabin, Ward finally opened the leather pouch. The smell of dried blood and old leather filled the small room. Inside were folded papers, stiff and stained dark brown along the creases. He unfolded them carefully. They were legal documents, surveyor's notes, and something that looked like a deed, all bearing the official, imposing wax seal of Arroyo County. This was not the property of a simple drifter, while Ward sat at his table, puzzling over the bloody papers. A new sound split the afternoon air. It was sharper than the windmill's groan. It was the sound of hammering. He went outside, down by his last reliable stream, the one the cattle depended on. 3 men were driving wooden stakes into the ground. They wore clean hats and carried tripods and measuring chains. A wagon with the emblem of the Transcontinental Railroad was parked nearby. Ward walked toward them, his steps slow and deliberate. A man separated from the group, a man with a clipboard and a holster worn with the confidence of authority. "This is private land," Ward said, stopping 10 feet away. The man, who introduced himself as Edric Sloan, the crew supervisor, smiled. It was a thin, dismissive expression. "Not according to our maps, friend, this section." He tapped his clipboard. "Is public domain. We're surveying the new spur line." "This stream is part of the Willow Notch deed," Ward insisted, feeling a cold anger rise in his chest. "The deed boundaries are being reassessed," Sloan said, his voice flat and bored. "This whole valley is opening up. Progress. McKinnon. You can't stand in the way of it." He pointed to the stakes. "This land is being reclaimed by the railroad, under governmental authority. I'd move your cattle if I were you. This water belongs to the spur line now." Sloan turned his back, signaling to his men to continue. The sound of the mallets driving the stakes into Ward's land felt like blows against his own chest. He was being squeezed. Braddock on one side, the railroad on the other. They were choking him out, taking his water, leaving him with nothing but dust and debt. Ward looked at the stake, then back at his cabin. In his pocket, his fingers found the cold, pitted iron key. He thought of the drifter's last, desperate words. Do not let the railroad take Mesquite Draw. Keep my word to June. He looked at the surveyors stealing his water, and he looked toward the distant shape of Larkspur Crossing. The drifter's death and the railroad's arrival on the same day could not be a coincidence. He pulled his hat low, his decision made. He was out of options, out of time, and out of feed. All he had left was a dead man's promise and a pouch of bloody papers. He had to find June Calloway, the fate of the valley. He suddenly realized, might depend on it. June Calloway had returned to Larkspur Crossing 3 days ago, and the bell above her mercantile door had not stopped ringing. She had spent the winter back east, a necessary, suffocating trip to finalize the sale of a small property her late husband had owned, and the return to the high, dry air of Basin Dust Haven felt like her first true breath in months. Calloway's mercantile was an oasis of order in a town defined by dust and desperation. The air inside smelled of ground coffee beans, sharp vinegar, raw cured tobacco, and the sizing on new bolts of calico. June kept it swept, the wide pine floorboards scrubbed, the tins of peaches and beans stacked with their labels facing forward. She was a young widow, but the term felt ill-fitting. It suggested a delicate, grieving creature. June was neither. She had been a field nurse, setting bones and stitching wounds in canvas tents while men screamed. That life had taught her that survival was a matter of structure. Now, her structure was this store. She was known for her straightforwardness, which the men of the town respected, and for her absolute refusal of charity, which they did not always understand. If a man was short on credit, she would not give him flour. She would, however, trade it for 3 hours of mending her back fence. She despised the feeling of being beholden to anyone. A shuffling sound came from the back room, followed by the scrape of a crate. "Pippa!" June called, her voice firm but not unkind. "If you are dragging that crate, you are chipping the floor. Lift with your knees, not your back." A small girl of perhaps 8, with hair the color of dusty straw, appeared in the doorway, her face set in concentration. She was followed by a boy, Tam, a year or 2 older, who carried a broom. They were cousins, the last remnants of a wagon train that had passed through 2 summers ago, their parents taken by cholera within a week of each other. The rest of the train had moved on, but the children, too sick to travel, had been left in the parson's care. The parson, overwhelmed, had turned to June. They were not her children. She referred to them, formally, as her boarded scholars, in exchange for a cot in the dry storeroom and 3 meals a day. They stocked shelves, swept the floors, and, for 2 hours every evening, sat at the counter learning their letters and sums. June was a demanding teacher and a strict guardian. She ensured they were fed, clean, and educated. There was no sentimentality in the arrangement, but there was absolute safety. They were the only 2 people in the world who did not have to pay, in cash or barter, for what they got from her store. The bell above the door jangled, a harsh, metallic sound that cut through the quiet morning. Pippa and Tam vanished back into the storeroom. June looked up from the ledger she was marking. Ward McKinnon stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light. He held his hat in his hands, his knuckles white. He was a man she knew by sight but not by conversation, a rancher from the Dry Willow Notch, one of the few smallholders left who had not yet been swallowed by the bigger outfits or crushed by the bank. And the bank was Silas Braddock. Silas Braddock was the polite, inescapable face of ruin in the valley. He sat in his mahogany office at the Larkspur Bank, a man who dressed in Eastern suits and spoke in a soft voice. He controlled the water rights, held the notes on nearly every ranch, and was the silent, primary investor in the new transcontinental spur line that was slicing its way toward the mountains. He was a man who understood that true power was not in holding a gun, but in holding the mortgage. He acquired land not with violence, but with foreclosure. Squeezing ranchers with interest rates a suffocating 20% that were impossible to clear. He was, June knew, the reason the railroad surveyors were suddenly swarming the valley, and the reason men like Ward McKinnon looked constantly haunted. Ward stepped inside, bringing the smell of dust and the faint, metallic tang of gunpowder with him. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes scanning the shelves as if looking for an escape route. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice was rough, like dry stones rubbing together. "Mr. McKinnon, I heard you'd lost some cattle in the late frost. I trust the rest of your herd is holding." Ward just nodded, his gaze dropping to the counter. I was told to find you, to find June, at Larkspur Crossing." June's posture stiffened slightly. This was not a request for credit. He reached into his saddlebag, which he still had slung over his shoulder, and pulled out two objects. He placed them on the clean, polished wood of her counter. The first was a heavy iron key, pitted with rust, its design old and strange. The second was a small leather pouch, stiff and dark. It was stained with a significant amount of dried blood. June looked at the pouch, her mind instantly shifting. She was not a shopkeeper now. She was the nurse who had stanched wounds by firelight. She looked at Ward's face, not at the object. "Whose blood?" "A drifter," Ward said. "He rode onto my land yesterday morning. He was gone. He fell from his horse. I was with him at the end." "And he gave you this?" "He told me," Ward said, his voice lowering. "To keep his word, to you." June felt a prickle of unease. She used a small letter opener to nudge the pouch, turning it over. On the flap was a wax seal, unbroken, impressed with a set of scales and the letter P. She recognized it immediately. Everyone who lived on the margins of the law knew that seal. It was the mark of Norville Pike. Pike was a lawyer who kept an office above the saloon, a man who drank whiskey before breakfast but possessed a mind sharper than any judge in the county. He specialized in the lost causes miners who had been cheated of claims, drifters who wanted to leave their saddle and rifle to a friend, and outcasts who needed one last document to prove they had ever existed. He was the repository for the secrets of the dispossessed. June broke the seal. She pulled out the folded papers. They were stiff, the blood having soaked through the leather. She carefully unfolded the top document, her eyes scanning the tight, precise script. It was a last will and testament. "The man," Ward said. "He mentioned Mesquite Draw. He said not to let the railroad take it." June held up a hand for silence, her eyes flying across the page. The document was dated 3 months prior. It named the testator as one Hollis Creed. It was, as she had suspected, filed and witnessed by Norville Pike. She read the bequeathal clause twice, her blood running cold despite the warmth of the store. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Hollis Creed left his entire estate, properties known and unknown, claims registered and unregistered, to a single heir. It was not left to a relative, or a friend, or an institution. It was left, the will stated, to the man, stranger or friend, who holds my hand at the end. For I have lived my life alone, and I will not die the same. June looked up at Ward. Her breath caught in her chest. Ward was staring at the document, his expression unreadable. "There's a condition," June said, her voice barely a whisper. She read the final, critical line aloud. "This inheritance shall be executed only if, and only if, the recipient's testimony of my passing is witnessed and confirmed as truthful by Mrs. June Calloway of Larkspur Crossing. Who knows my character?" Ward looked at her, his confusion plain. "He knew you." June's mind flashed back. Hollis Creed. The name resonated like a plucked string. It was not a fever dream. Last winter, during the heavy snow, a man had stumbled into her store, shaking with a lung fever, his cough wet and rattling. He had paid in silver coin for quinine and laudanum. It was Hollis. She had let him sleep for 2 nights by the stove in the back room, on the very spot where Pippa and Tam's cots now sat. He had been suspicious, secretive, clutching a leather pouch to his chest even in his fever. He had raved, not about snakes or devils, but about surveyors. He had claimed the Transcontinental had stolen his line, that their maps were drawn on lies, that he had the original claim on the water rights at Mesquite Draw. She had thought him mad. Another prospector broken by the sun and solitude. Now, she saw. He was not mad. He was strategic. He had made her the town's most unshakable witness, the lock on his legacy. "Yes," June said, her voice shaking slightly. "I knew him. I treated him last winter. He told me he had a claim against the railroad." She looked from the will to Ward's face. "You held his hand?" "I did," Ward said. "His hand was cold. He died, and now—" He gestured to the window. "The railroad is driving stakes at my stream. They say my land is public domain. They say they're taking the water." The pieces clicked into place with the terrible sound of a closing trap. The news spread through Larkspur Crossing with the speed of a prairie fire. The parson had filed a John Doe death. Now, within hours, the town knew. The drifter had a name. He had a lawyer. And he had a will. By noon, the talk in the Red Dog Saloon was not of the weather, but of the sudden fortune of Ward McKinnon. The narrative took shape instantly. The dirt-poor rancher, the luckiest man in the valley, had stumbled into a dying man's gold mine. The rumor, predictably, found its way to the mahogany desk of Silas Braddock. He sat, listening to the report from one of his tellers. He steepled his fingers, his expression unchanged, but a cold, calculating light appeared in his eyes. A variable had entered his clean equation. A debtor, McKinnon, who was days from foreclosure, suddenly had an asset, if the saloon talk was right, tied to a claim, and any claim in this valley, Braddock knew, eventually led back to the railroad. His railroad. He sent a quiet message to Edric Sloan, the railroad supervisor. "Find out what this drifter left behind. I do not like complications. See to it that Mr. McKinnon understands the folly of standing in the way of progress." Ward, oblivious to the forces beginning to move against him, returned to Willow Notch. He stood by the new survey stakes that marked the theft of his water. He looked at the will, which June had allowed him to take. He did not feel lucky. He felt like a man who had been handed a live stick of dynamite. He did not want Hollis Creed's fortune. He wanted his water. He wanted the bank off his back. He wanted to be left alone. But the dying man's words echoed in his head. Do not let them take Mesquite Draw. This was not about money. This was about the land. He rode back to town that evening. The lights were on in the mercantile. June was alone at the counter. The children presumably asleep. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, standing in the doorway again. "Mr. McKinnon." She did not look up from her ledger. "Will you do it, will you? Confirm my testimony. Will you be my witness?" June closed the ledger. She looked at him, her eyes clear and assessing. She saw a man in a corner, not a fortune hunter, but she also knew the man he was up against. Silas Braddock would not let this go. "I will," she said, her voice cutting the silence. "But on one condition. Anything. This will not be a backroom deal. This will not be a quiet filing. I will not have my name used in a swindle, either by you or against you. We will take this to Norville Pike tomorrow. We will file it legally, and when the time comes, I will stand up in court, and I will read the entire contents of that will, and I will say exactly what I know of Hollis Creed. No more, and no less. We will do this by the book, Mr. McKinnon, or we will not do it at all." Ward nodded, a grim relief settling on him. "By the book, Mrs. Calloway." June nodded once, sharp and final. "Then you should prepare yourself. Silas Braddock does not like to be surprised." The office of Norville Pike was located above the Red Dog Saloon. To reach it, one had to climb a narrow, rickety staircase that smelled of stale whiskey, cigar smoke, and defeat. The noise of the saloon below, a tinny piano, the clack of glasses, a sudden roar of laughter was the constant soundtrack to Pike's legal work. Pike himself was a man who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts. He wore a rumpled linen suit, His white hair was a frantic halo, and his eyes, though bloodshot, were alarmingly sharp. He was pouring his first whiskey of the morning when Ward and June arrived, the pouch and the will in Ward's hand. "McKinnon, Calloway," Pike grunted, gesturing to two worn chairs. "I heard the saloon gossip. Figured you'd be here before the hangover." Ward placed the will on the desk. "You witnessed this." Pike downed the whiskey in one gulp and picked up the document. He held it to the light, his eyes tracing the signature. "Aye, that's Hollis Creed's hand. And this," he tapped the wax seal, "is my own. He filed it with me 3 months ago. Came in here shaking, said he was feeling a tightness in his chest. Wanted his affairs in order. He gave me this too," Ward said, placing the heavy, pitted iron key on the desk. Pike looked at the key, then at Ward, then at June. A slow smile spread across his face. Did he now, the cautious old badger? Pike did not use the key on a strongbox. He walked to a towering, dusty bookshelf, pulled out a thick volume of county law, and inserted the key into a lock hidden in the shelf behind it. A section of the shelf clicked open, revealing not a safe, but a hidden drawer. Hollis didn't trust banks, Pike explained, pulling a thick oilcloth packet from the drawer. Especially not Braddock's. He said if he died under suspicious circumstances, the key would find its way to the right hands, and those hands would find their way to me. He untied the packet. He was right. He unrolled a map and a sheaf of associated documents, smoothing them onto his desk. Hollis Creed was not just a drifter. McKinnon, he was a quarry man. He owned the old slate quarry up near Bitter Creek. Bought the claim 20 years ago. June leaned forward. "The slate quarry that's been defunct for a year. The access road washed out." "It didn't wash out. Mrs. Calloway," Pike said, his finger tracing a line on the map. "It was stolen." He tapped the paper. Hollis was a surveyor's apprentice in his youth. He knew that land better than any man alive. "This," he pointed to a faded line, "is the official Arroyo County boundary, established in 1871, marked by the formation known as Bell Rock." His finger moved an inch south. "And this is the line the transcontinental surveyors staked out 3 months ago. The line Edric Sloan is using to justify his work." Ward saw it instantly. "They moved the boundary. They mistakenly staked it 1/2 mile south," Pike corrected, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A clerical error. But that error just so happens to cut Mesquite Draw entirely out of Hollis's land and place it, and your stream, McKinnon, firmly on public domain land being granted to the railroad." "But Mesquite Draw," June began, the implications dawning on her, "is the only pass wide enough for a wagon to reach the slate quarry." Pike finished. "The railroad didn't just trespass. They illegally seized his access. They blockaded his quarry, cut off his livelihood, and bankrupted his operation. Hollis was preparing the biggest lawsuit this county has ever seen. So, the inheritance," Ward said, his voice low. "It's not just the quarry. The quarry is worthless without the road." Pike said, "The inheritance, Mr. McKinnon, is the compensation claim against the railroad for the illegal seizure. And if this map is correct, the railroad owes Hollis Creed's estate." He paused, rubbing his jaw. "Well, let's just say it's enough to make Silas Braddock's 20% interest look like pocket change. It's enough to buy this valley twice over." For a moment, Ward felt a dizzying rush of relief. This was it. This was the weapon. Pike poured another whiskey. "Do not," he said, shattering the moment. "Look so happy. You haven't won anything. You've just become the single biggest obstacle to Braddock's plan." "We have the will. We have the map," June countered, her voice firm. "We have a piece of paper." Pike shot back. "And we're taking it into a courtroom owned by Silas Braddock, the circuit judge. Greeley Tusk is a man who signs whatever Silas puts in front of him. Tusk will look at this will and laugh. He will say it is a fraud. He will say a desperate, indebted rancher." He nodded at Ward. "Conspired with an interested party." He nodded at June. "To steal a dead man's claim." "But you're a witness," Ward said. I'm a whiskey-soaked lawyer who operates above a saloon. Tusk will paint me as an opportunist. No, Tusk will demand a second, impartial witness. Someone unimpeachable. Someone who can testify that Hollis Creed was of sound mind and, crucially, that he was aware of this compensation claim at the time he made you his witness. The hope evaporated, leaving the dry taste of alkali. June was silent, her mind racing back through the cold winter days, back to the smell of quinine and the sound of the man coughing by her stove. "Wait," she said, her eyes snapping to Pike. "When Hollis was recovering, he insisted on paying me for the medicine. I refused, so he said he was giving a donation to the Parsons Poor Box. I took the coins to Parson Bramwell myself." "A donation," Pike said, leaning forward. "Bramwell gave me a receipt." June continued, the memory becoming clearer. "Hollis was there. He countersigned the Parsons' own donation ledger. He insisted on it. I remember thinking it was strange. He made a note on the line, right next to his signature." "What did the note say?" Ward asked, his voice tight. "It said," June replied, a slow, triumphant smile touching her lips, "For services rendered, pending compensation." Parson Bramwell was a good man, but he did not like to be hurried, and he did not like his ledgers being involved in legal matters. "Mrs. Calloway, this is highly irregular," he fretted, as he, June, and Ward stood in the quiet, sun-drenched chapel. "Parson, please," June urged. "It is a matter of profound importance, a man's legacy." They had not gone directly to the chapel. First, they had to cross the main street, which was choked with freight traffic. June, her mind on the ledger, had stepped off the boardwalk, calling for Pippa and Tam, who were sweeping the porch of the Mercantile. "Pippa, take the broom inside, and you and Tam stay in the back room until I return." Pippa, startled by the urgency in June's voice, stepped back. But at that exact moment, a heavy dray wagon hauling railroad ties swung wide around the corner. The driver, perched high, did not see the small child. The lead horse, a massive chestnut, shied at the girl's sudden movement. Pippa froze, a small figure against a wall of oncoming iron and horseflesh. June screamed her name. It was over before June could even take a step. Ward, who had been scanning the street, moved with a rancher's explosive, practiced speed. He was not fast, but he was efficient. He crossed the 10 feet of dusty road in 2 long strides, one arm encircling Pippa's waist, lifting her clean off the ground. He did not try to run back. He spun, turning his own back to the wagon, shielding the child with his body as the heavy harness of the led horse brushed his shoulder. The impact threw them both off balance, sending them tumbling into the dust, but clear of the heavy, churning wheels. The wagon thundered past. June rushed forward, her heart lodged in her throat. Ward was already on his knees, his hands on Pippa's shoulders. The girl was rigid, silent with terror, but unharmed. "You're all right," Ward said, his voice low and steady. "Just a little dust. You're safe." He lifted her and handed her to June, who hugged the girl so tightly she gasped. June looked at Ward, who was already standing, brushing the dirt from his sleeves. His face was calm. He had not hesitated. He had not calculated. He had simply acted. He was not a man, she realized, who acted only for profit. "Let's go see the parson," he said, as if he had just helped her across a puddle. They cut through the narrow alley behind the blacksmith's forge, a shortcut to the chapel. The air was hot and still, smelling of coal smoke, hot iron, and manure. They were halfway through when 3 men stepped out from behind a stack of barrels, blocking their path. They were not townsfolk. They wore the hard, identical look of railroad muscle. Ward recognized one of them from Sloane's survey crew. "McKinnon," the man said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "That's far enough, mister. Sloane heard you found some papers, a map. He figures that's railroad property." Ward gently pushed June behind him. "This is not your concern. Step aside." "I don't think so," the man said, smiling. Two of his companions fanned out. "We can take the papers from you, or we can take them from your body. Your choice." One man lunged for June. Ward met him with a straight right hand that sent the man staggering back into a water trough. But the other two were on him. Ward was strong, but he was not a brawler. He slammed one man against the brick wall, but the third hit him hard in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. Ward grunted, stumbling. The man raised a fist to strike again. June did not scream. She acted. She grabbed the heavy, soot-stained oil lantern hanging from a hook by the blacksmith's door. With all her strength, she swung it, not at the man, but at the ground at his feet. The glass shattered, splashing kerosene over his boots and the dusty ground. "Get back!" she yelled, her hand diving into her apron pocket and emerging with a small box of matches. The man froze, looking at his saturated boots. The man Ward was fighting laughed. Turning to see, "What's the little lady gonna do, Lyda?" June's other hand emerged from her apron, this time holding a small, newly purchased tin. She snapped the lid off and, with a furious, precise motion, threw the contents directly into the man's laughing face. It was a full tin of finely ground cayenne pepper. The man's laugh turned into a choked, high-pitched scream. He dropped Ward instantly, his hands clawing at his eyes, his entire face a mask of red powder and agony. Ward didn't waste the opening. He drove his boot into the stomach of the man soaked in kerosene, doubling him over. The first man, climbing out of the trough, saw his friend screaming blindly and the other gasping on the ground. He looked at June, who still held the matches, her face pale but resolute. He decided the pay was not worth being set on fire. He turned and fled the alley. Ward grabbed June's hand. "Now we run!" They burst into the chapel, gasping for air, reeking of pepper and lamp oil. Parson Bramwell nearly dropped his Bible. "My ledger," June panted. "Last winter, January." Frightened by their state, Bramwell quickly retrieved the heavy, leather-bound book. June's fingers, trembling slightly, flipped through the pages. "There," she pointed. The entry was clear. In Bramwell's neat script, January 12th, donation, Mr. Hollis Creed, $5, and beside it, in a cramped, forceful hand that was clearly not the parson's H. Creed, for services. Pending CRAR compensation claim, CRAR. Continental Railroad. Pike slammed his fist on his desk, a cloud of dust rising. "That's it. That's the anchor. Bramwell is unimpeachable. The note proves Hollis was of sound mind and actively engaged in the claim. Tusk can't dismiss it." He immediately began drafting the civil suit, his pen scratching furiously across the parchment. Ward McKinnon, heir to the estate of Hollis Creed, versus the Transcontinental Railroad Company. He filed for full compensation for the slate quarry, punitive damages for the illegal seizure, and an immediate injunction to halt all railroad work at Mesquite Draw. The news hit Larkspur Crossing like a bolt of lightning. The lawsuit was filed, posted publicly. The town was electrified. A poor rancher was taking on the railroad. The news reached Silas Braddock 2 hours later. He listened to the report without expression. He steepled his fingers, looking out his window at the town he controlled. He could not, he knew, attack the lawsuit directly. Pike had anchored it too well, so he attacked the man. The next morning, a notice was nailed to the weathered front door of Ward McKinnon's ranch house. An identical copy was posted in the front window of the Larkspur Bank, for the entire town to see. It was a foreclosure notice. The property known as Willow Notch Ranch, in default of its loan, would be seized by the bank. Payment in full was demanded. The public auction was scheduled in precisely 10 days. The foreclosure notice gave Ward McKinnon 10 days. 10 days until the Willow Notch Ranch was auctioned on the bank's steps. 10 days to fight a legal battle that required time, which Silas Braddock had just stolen from him. The railroad surveyors, emboldened, had rerouted the creek, diverting the last reliable trickle away from Ward's land and toward their new spur line. His cattle, already thin, began to low with a new, desperate thirst. His well was down to mud. He was hauling water in barrels from the old community spring 3 miles away. A back-breaking, hopeless task when June Calloway appeared. She was not on her town buggy. She was riding a sturdy mare and leading another, a strong-shouldered bay named Lark. "Mr. McKinnon," she said, her voice clear and carrying over the creak of his wagon wheels. She did not offer sympathy. "That mare, Lark, she's a pulling horse. She can haul twice what your old gelding can. Hitch her up." Ward stopped, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a sleeve already dark with it. He looked at her, at the fine horse, and at the clean, determined set of her jaw. "Mrs. Calloway, I can't pay for—" "I am not asking for payment," she cut him off, her voice sharp, not with anger, but with impatience. "I am making an investment. Your lawsuit is the only thing standing between Silas Braddock and this entire valley. If you lose your ranch, the lawsuit loses its power. Now, are you going to use the horse, or are you going to argue with me?" For the rest of the day, they worked. They did not talk much. They hauled water, filling his troughs, his cistern, the barrels by his porch. The work was grueling. The sun beat down, and the alkali dust caked their clothes and skin. June worked like a woman accustomed to physical labor, her movements economical and sure. She was not a fragile town widow. She was a partner, as the sun bled into the western hills, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. They sat on the porch of his cabin. The air was finally cooling. The only sound was the tired breathing of the horses and the distant, grieving call of a dove. The meal was as sparse as the land itself. They ate roasted corn, slightly blackened from the fire, and dipped chunks of hardtack into a small tin of molasses. It was the best meal Ward had had in a month. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained with dirt and axle grease. "He picked the wrong man, you know," Ward said, his voice quiet, not meant to carry. June looked at him, her face softened by the twilight. "Hollis, I've never been chosen for anything," Ward said, the confession pulling from him. "My whole life has been about holding on, holding this land from the drought, holding the herd from the fever, holding the bank at bay. It's all I know how to do. I don't know how to be the man who wins something." He shook his head. "I'm just trying to keep what's mine. I don't dream any farther than that." June was silent for a long moment, watching the last sliver of sun vanish. "My husband, Thomas, he did dream," she said, her voice taking on a distant quality. "He dreamed of this place. He said the air was clean, that it was a place a man could build a future. We came here, and for a year, it was... Then the malaria came up from the river bottoms. It took him in 3 days." Ward looked at her, at the strength in her profile. He had not known. "I buried him," she continued, "and I had a choice. I could go back east, back to my family, and be a grieving widow. Or I could stay. I stayed, not for his dream, but for a promise. I promised him I would not be broken by this land. I promised I would make a life here, my mercantile, my teaching. That is my promise. This town is my promise." She turned to look at him, her eyes clear in the growing dark. "You are not just holding on, Mr. McKinnon. You are keeping a promise to Hollis Creed, and, I think, to yourself. That is why he chose you." The next day, in town, the pressure was a palpable thing. Men who usually greeted Ward with a nod now looked away, afraid to be seen associating with the man who had angered Silas Braddock. Ward stopped by the mercantile to return a coil of rope June had lent him. He found her not behind the counter, but on the wide, covered porch. Pippa and Tam, the 2 children, sat on a bench, their heads bent over a single, worn primer. "Pete!" Tam struggled, his finger on the page. "Sound it out," June said patiently. "You know the sound. P, T, pat, pat," Pippa whispered, her face bright. "Pat the dog." "Very good. Pippa," June said, a rare, soft smile touching her lips. Ward watched from the street for a moment. He saw the teacher now, the woman who built things with letters instead of lumber. He walked up the steps, his boots heavy. The children fell silent, looking at him with wide, wary eyes. "Mr. McKinnon," June said, nodding, her professional manner back in place. Ward nodded back. He set the rope down. He found himself looking at the children, at their thin, eager faces. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his whittling knife and a small block of soft pine he always carried. He sat on the porch step, a few feet away, and began to work. The children watched, mesmerized, as the knife moved, peeling away curls of wood. In the quiet of the afternoon, a shape began to emerge. It was not a horse or a man. It was a small, sturdy boat, complete with a tiny mast. He worked for nearly an hour, the lawsuit and the foreclosure fading to the back of his mind, replaced by the simple, satisfying task. When he was finished, he sanded it smooth with a piece of rough canvas and held it out to Pippa. She looked at June, who nodded. The girl took the boat, her hands reverent. "Boats are good," Ward said quietly, mostly to himself. "They can get stuck in the mud or run aground, but they can also turn around, find a new channel." He looked up and met June's eyes. She understood. This was not just a toy. It was a prayer. That evening, as June was locking the front door of the mercantile, a folded piece of paper slid under the door, from the darkness outside. June froze. The children were asleep in the back. She picked up the paper. The handwriting was crude, written in block letters. It contained only 4 words. "Do not go to court." She stood for a long time, the paper in her hand. This was Sloane's work, or Braddock's. It was the first direct threat. She thought of the men in the alley. She thought of Pippa and the wagon. She did not shred it. She walked to the pot-bellied stove, which still held a few dying embers. She lifted the grate, tore the paper in 2 precise halves, and dropped them onto the coals. She watched until the edges curled black and the words were consumed by fire. Her hand was perfectly steady. The rain came that night. 2 days later, it was not a gentle, nourishing rain, but a violent, wind-driven deluge that hammered the dry earth. Ward was asleep, but the sound of water inside his cabin woke him instantly. A steady stream was pouring through the roof, splashing onto his table. He lit a lantern. The old sod roof, cracked and dry, had finally given way. He was dragging the table out of the way when a frantic pounding came at his door. He opened it, revolver in hand. June stood there, soaked to the skin, her mare panting behind her. She was holding a heavy canvas tarp. "The creek!" she yelled over the wind. "It's flash flooding. The railroad's diversion dam broke the water. It's heading for the draw, but it's also backing up toward your barn." They worked in the driving, horizontal rain, using her horse and his to drag his few remaining cattle to the small rise behind the cabin. The water was rising, a muddy, churning river that tore at the survey stakes and ripped them from the ground. By the time the cattle were safe, the rain had lessened, but the damage to his cabin roof was worse. The stream was now a torrent. "It will ruin everything I have left," Ward said, the water dripping from his hat. "Then fix it," June said, shivering, her hair plastered to her face. They went inside. He found his tools, a hammer and some old shingles. "I can't. The main rafter is split. I can't hold the patch and nail it at the same time." "Then I will hold it," June said. She dragged the heavy wooden ladder from the wall and steadied it. "Go!" Ward climbed, the lantern hanging from a peg, casting wild, dancing shadows. He balanced precariously on the crossbeam, the wind and rain still howling through the new hole. June stood at the base of the ladder, her hands white-knuckled on the rungs, her eyes fixed on him. "It's slick up here," he called down. "I am holding it," she replied, her voice a solid anchor in the storm. "Just do the work." He hammered, the sound deadened by the storm. He needed to brace the shingle, but the angle was wrong. He shifted. His boot slipped on the wet wood, and he started to fall. He dropped the hammer, his hand grabbing for the rafter, but he missed. He felt himself go. June did not move. She did not scream. She simply held the ladder, planted her feet, and, as he fell, she reached up, her hand closing around his forearm. her grip like iron. She could not stop his fall, but she stopped his momentum, guiding his crash onto the ladder itself instead of the floor. He hung there for a second, breathless, his chest pressed against the rungs. Her hand was still locked on his arm. He looked down. She was looking up. Her face was soaked, streaked with lamp black, but her eyes were luminous in the lantern light. They were inches apart. He could feel the warmth of her hand through his wet shirt, a small, fierce point of heat in the cold chaos. He smelled the rain, the wet wood, and the faint, clean scent of the soap she sold in her store. They stayed like that, their eyes holding for a beat, then two, then three. It was longer than a simple breath. It was a silent, shared acknowledgement. She had held him. "Well," June said, her voice trembling only slightly. "Everyone needs a witness." Ward found his footing on the ladder. His hand covered hers on his arm. He did not let go. Not for a moment. "Thank you, June." He climbed back up and finished the patch. When he came down, the storm was passing. The only sound was the drip of water. They stood in the cabin, both of them soaked and shivering. "If I win this," Ward said, his voice rough, "if Pike wins this, the first thing I do is pay Braddock his due, every cent." "I would expect nothing less," June said, wringing water from her hair. "But the rest of it," he said, looking at her, willing her to understand. "The compensation. It's not for me. This town. The community went dry 2 years ago. We've all been hauling water, or begging Braddock for rights. The first thing I do with that money is drill a new well, a deep one, and I'm putting it right in the center of town, public and free, for everyone." June stopped, her hands still. She looked at him, and the exhaustion and the fear were gone, replaced by something else. Her eyes, which he had seen as only firm and assessing, were suddenly, undeniably, soft. She saw the man who had turned to shield a child. She saw the man who whittled a boat of hope. She saw the man who would use a fortune to give his neighbors water. She simply nodded. A slow, small movement. It was not agreement. It was a choice. A choice had been made. The preliminary hearing was set for 9 o'clock the next morning. The foreclosure auction was 8 days later. Time was a luxury Ward McKinnon no longer had. He rode into Larkspur late, the air thick and unsettled, smelling of distant rain and trouble. He was meeting June and Pike for a final strategy session. He saw the light on in Pike's office, above the saloon, and climbed the rickety stairs, his boots heavy. He found Pike standing not in his office, but on the landing, staring at the splintered wood of his own door. The lock had been shattered, the door kicked open. "He's been here," Pike said. His voice was not slurred with whiskey. It was cold, sober, and far more dangerous. Ward pushed the door open. The office was a maelstrom. Pike's life's work files, books, affidavits had been ripped from shelves and cabinets, tossed to the floor, trampled. It was an act of pure, frantic violence. "What did they take?" Ward asked, his hand dropping to his holster. "What they thought they needed," Pike said, his sharp eyes surveying the chaos. "They tore apart the foreclosure files, the mining claims. They were looking for the will and the map. And they didn't find them," a voice said from the doorway. June Calloway stood there, her face pale but resolute. In her hands, she carried a heavy tin document box. "I took them, Mr. Pike, after Mr. Braddock's visit. I didn't like them sitting up here. I kept the originals at the Mercantile, under the floorboards beneath the children's cots. I trusted no one." Pike let out a long, slow breath and nodded, a look of profound respect in his bloodshot eyes. "Mrs. Calloway, you are a finer lawyer than I am." Ward moved to the window, which had been smashed from the outside. He knelt, examining the sill. In the thin layer of mud from the previous night's rain, he saw it, a clear boot print, half in, half out. It had a distinctive mark on the heel, a steel plate, shaped like a crescent. Sloan, Ward said, his voice flat and cold. I've seen it before, the day they staked my stream. He'll know by now he has nothing, Pike said, righting his overturned desk. He tore this place apart and came up empty. He won't stop. He'll go for the Mercantile next. He'll go for you, Mrs. Calloway. And he'll go for you, McKinnon. He has to stop you both from testifying tomorrow. Then we split up, Ward said. The decision immediate. Sloan is angry, but he's sloppy. He left tracks, a single rider, heading east, toward the flats. He's reporting back, or getting more men. I'm going after him. I'm going to make sure he doesn't come back to town tonight. Ward, that is a fool's errand. June protested, clutching the box. He's an enforcer, and I'm a rancher. Ward said, I know how to track, and I know how to hunt predators. You, he said, turning to June, have the more important job. You are the custodian of the evidence. Go back to the Mercantile. Lock the doors. Do not let anyone in. Protect that box. Protect the children. I'll be back by dawn. And what if he is not alone? She asked, her voice low. He won't be expecting to be the one who is hunted. He turned and was gone, his steps 2 at a time down the stairs, leaving June and Pike in the wrecked office. The tracks were clear in the moonlight. Cutting east toward the Saltbrush Flats, a treacherous, marshy land of alkali mud and dense, 8-foot-high reeds. Sloan was moving fast, but Ward, on his lighter, surer-footed horse, was faster. He dismounted a mile from the swamp, tethering his horse where it wouldn't be seen, and went forward on foot. He moved through the reeds with a predator's silence. He soon heard them the sound of cursing, and the sucking sound of a horse mired in mud. He found them in a small clearing. Sloan and 2 of his men, their horses were spent, and one was hopelessly stuck in the brackish mud. They were arguing. Just shoot the damn thing, Sloan snarled. We have to get back. McKinnon and the woman are at the Mercantile. Braddock wants this done tonight. We can't walk back. Edric, one of the men whined. Ward watched from the reeds, his mind racing. He was 1 man against 3. He could not win a gunfight. He needed a diversion. He scanned the dark shapes. Nearby, almost invisible against the reeds, was a small, stray cow, part of a herd that grazed wild on the flats. Around her neck was a heavy brass bell. Silently, Ward moved. He unfastened the bell from the cow's neck, his hands gentle. He crept away, circling wide until he was on the opposite side of the clearing from the 3 men. He found a dense thicket, took off his canvas slicker, and draped it over a large, broken branch. In the murky light, it was a convincing silhouette of a man, crouched and waiting. He moved 20 yards to the left of the slicker. Then, he shook the cowbell. Hard, a sharp, metallic clanging that shattered the night. "Who's there?" Sloan roared, drawing his pistol. The men spun, guns out, staring into the darkness. Ward threw a baseball-sized rock hard into the reeds, far to his right. "There!" one of Sloan's men yelled, and fired blindly into the reeds. "No, there!" the other man shouted. Spotting the slicker, "In the thicket I see him." He and the first man opened fire, blasting the darkness, their muzzle flashes illuminating the decoy coat, while all 3 men were facing the wrong way, shooting at his coat. Ward burst from the reeds directly behind them. He was not there to fight. He was there to disarm and disrupt. He moved like lightning. He slammed into the back of the 3rd man, the one closest to him, driving him face first into the mud. He grabbed the man's rifle as he fell, swinging it like a club at Sloan, who was turning, his face a mask of shock. The rifle stock caught Sloan on the side of the head, sending him staggering. The other 2 men were turning, realizing the trick. Ward didn't wait. He threw the rifle deep into the swamp. He grabbed Sloan's pistol from its holster and the other man's from his belt, and threw them after it. "My horse is a mile from here," Ward said, breathing hard. "Yours are spent, and one is stuck. You've got a long walk back to town. Gentlemen, stay out of the swamp. It has a habit of swallowing things." Sloan, holding his head, stared at him with pure hatred. Ward backed away slowly, the cowbell in his hand, and melted back into the reeds, leaving the three armed men with nothing but their fists and a long, cold walk home. He circled back to his horse, a grim satisfaction settling on him. He had bought June a few hours, but Braddock had not relied solely on Sloane. As dawn approached, June stood in the mercantile, the document box on the counter. The children were asleep in the back. She was exhausted, her eyes burning from lack of sleep, but she was alert. The bell above the door jangled. June's hand went to the revolver Ward had left her, hidden beneath the counter. It was not Sloane, it was Silas Braddock. He was immaculate, dressed in his fine wool suit, his face calm and composed, as if he were on his way to church. He removed his hat, his eyes taking in the orderly store. "Mrs. Calloway, you are open early. I have work to do, Mr. Braddock." "Indeed, as do I." He walked closer, his voice low and reasonable. "I am here, June, to appeal to your sense of community. This lawsuit, it is a disruption. It threatens the prosperity that the railroad will bring. It is based on the whims of a dead, mad prospector and the desperation of a failed rancher. It is based on the law," June said, her voice steady. "The law?" Braddock smiled, a thin, cold expression. "The law is a tool, Mrs. Calloway. It can be used to build, or it can be used to obstruct. You are obstructing." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I am offering you a final chance at peace. Withdraw your testimony. State that you were mistaken. In return, McKinnon's foreclosure will be stayed indefinitely. Your own credit line, quadrupled. You and your wards will be secure. For life. All it costs is silence." A customer entered. Then another. It was Mr. and Mrs. Gable. "Come for supplies." They saw Braddock, sensed the tension, and immediately pretended to be fascinated by a stack of canned tomatoes. June looked at Braddock, then at the Gables, who were listening intently. She made a choice. She did not lower her voice. She raised it, her words clear and sharp, ringing through the silent store. "Mr. Braddock, are you attempting to bribe me? Are you offering to erase another man's debt if I commit perjury?" Braddock's smile vanished. The color drained from his face. The Gables froze, their eyes wide. "I am offering," June continued, her voice gaining strength. "You nothing. I am a witness, Mr. Braddock, and I will give my testimony. You cannot buy it, you cannot threaten it, and you cannot stop it. This is a mercantile. Sir, I sell flour and seed. I do not sell my conscience. Now, if you are not here to make a purchase, I must ask you to leave. My customers are waiting." Silas Braddock, a man who had never been spoken to this way in public, turned a deep, furious red. He was exposed, his methods laid bare for the town to hear. He put his hat back on, his movements stiff and jerky. He turned and stormed out of the store, the bell jangling furiously behind him. "Mrs." Gable stepped forward, her hands trembling. "June," she whispered, "he won't let this go. He's a snake." "Snakes only win in the dark," June said, her hands shaking now that it was over. The snake struck an hour later. Ward was riding back, the sun just beginning to touch the sky. When he saw the smoke, it was not from a chimney. It was a thick, black pillar, rising from the direction of his ranch. "No," he whispered, and dug his spurs into his horse. He was too late. By the time he arrived, the main barn is hay, his tech, his tools was a raging inferno. Sloane, having made it back to town, had taken his revenge. Ward leaped from his horse, grabbing a bucket, but it was hopeless. The roof was collapsing, a shower of sparks rising to meet the dawn. Ward June was there, on her mare, riding hard. Behind her was a wagon. It was Gable and Mr. Davies and two other small ranchers. They were carrying buckets, shovels, axes. "We saw the smoke," Gable yelled, jumping from the wagon. "Braddock's gone too far. He does this to you. He does it to us next." Sloane's men were gone, having fled. "The grain store," Ward shouted. his voice hoarse. The smaller, separate shed where he kept his last 2 sacks of cornmeal and seed grain was not yet on fire, but sparks were landing on its dry roof. "If we lose that, I'm done." They formed a bucket brigade, a desperate, frantic line from the cistern to the shed. Ward scrambled onto the roof, stomping out embers, while the men and June hurled buckets of water up to him. June, her face streaked with soot, was a field commander, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "Keep the line moving, Davies. Faster, Gable. Watch your footing." Pippa and Tam, who had come with the Gables, huddled by the ranch house, terrified. Pippa saw the embers igniting the dry grass around them. She looked at the wooden alphabet board she had brought with her from the wagon. "Tam," she yelled, her small voice shrill. "The fan stamped them." The 2 children, their faces set in grim determination, ran into the yard, using their school boards to beat out the small grass fires, their small motions a mirror of the larger battle. "Pippa, get back!" June screamed, her heart stopping. She ran, grabbed both children, and pulled them back to the safety of the wagon. "You stay here," she commanded, her voice shaking with fear and pride. No one was hurt. They fought for an hour, as the sun rose higher, illuminating the devastation. The main barn was gone, a smoking, skeletal ruin. But the grain store stood. They had saved it. Pike arrived on his horse, surveying the scene. He looked at the smoking barn, at the exhausted ranchers, at Ward, who was sliding off the roof, covered in ash. Ward walked to the cistern and picked up the oilcloth map tube, which had been dropped in the mud and soaked during the fight. "It's all over, Pike," Ward said, his voice dead. "He's won. He's burned me out." "No, he hasn't," Pike said, his eyes bright. He took the map tube from Ward. "He's just made his final mistake." Pike unrolled the wet map on the side of the cistern. The water had soaked the paper, but the surveyor's ink had not run, and the water had revealed something new. A watermark, pressed into the very fibers of the paper, invisible when dry. A faint, ghostly image was now clear in the morning light. It was an intricate drawing of a bell-shaped rock formation. "Bell Rock," Ward whispered. "It's not just a map," Pike said, his voice electric with discovery. "It's the original county registration paper. Sloan's map is a forgery, but this proves our boundary. This is the smoking gun." "It's enough," June said, relief flooding her. "Tusk will have to accept it." "Accept it, yes," Pike said, a feral grin spreading across his face. "But winning in court isn't enough. Not anymore." He looked from the map to the burned-out barn, then at the faces of the other ranchers. "Braddock wins by operating in the shadows. He wins with threats and arson. We win by dragging him into the light. We are not just going to present this in court. We are going to present this to the town. We will make copies of this map, of the will, of the parson's ledger. We will nail them to the bank door. By the time that hearing starts, every man, woman, and child in Larkspur will know what Braddock did. He won't be able to bribe his way out of a room full of witnesses." Pike and the other ranchers were gone. They had taken the originals of the will, the ledger, and the miraculously revealed watermark map, wrapped in fresh oilcloth. They were riding hard for Larkspur, to spend the night making copies, to prepare for the public unveiling that would precede the hearing. The acrid stench of wet ash and scorched pine hung heavy in the air, a funeral shroud for the Willow Notch Ranch. Ward stood alone, a solitary figure against the backdrop of his life's work, now just a lattice of blackened, smoking timbers. The main barn was gone. His tools, his hay, his saddle. The cradle his father had built, all of it was ash. He was coated in a paste of soot and sweat. The adrenaline that had driven him to fight the flames, to stand on the roof, to save the grain store, had finally drained away, leaving a bone-deep, hollow exhaustion. He had won the small battle, but the smoking ruin felt like the end of the war. He did not hear her ride back. The crackle of the dying fire and the soughing of the wind masked the sound of her mare's hooves. He only knew she was there when she spoke his name, her voice quiet, seeming to come from the dusk itself. "Ward." He turned, his movement stiff. June Calloway sat on her horse, not as the field commander he had seen hours before, but as a woman etched with a profound, shared weariness. She had not stayed in the relative safety of town. She had returned. She dismounted, tying Lark to the hitching post, and approached him, carrying a small wooden box in a canteen. "You are hurt," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, made with the quiet authority of a nurse who has seen too much. He looked down, as if just realizing it. His left forearm, which he had used to shield his face from a cascade of sparks, was a map of angry red welts. A long, weeping burn marked his wrist where a superheated rope had snapped against him. "It is nothing," he said, his voice a low rasp. The smoke had torn at his throat. "It will be infected by morning," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Come inside the cabin." The cabin itself was a small island of chaos in the greater ruin. The floor was slick with mud and ash from the roof patch. The air was damp and cold, but the small stone hearth was lit. She had been here before him. A small fire crackled, a single point of defiant warmth. A pot of coffee, his last, was already brewing, its rich scent cutting through the smell of smoke. She had, in the midst of his devastation, begun to restore order. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to the single, rough-hewn table. He obeyed, slumping onto the bench. He felt a tremor in his hands, the delayed shock of the fire. June lit a second kerosene lamp. The dual light, one from the hearth, one from the table, softened the harsh lines of the small room. It illuminated the exhaustion etched around his eyes and the soot streaked like war paint across his cheekbones. She opened the wooden box. It was her nurse's kit. Inside, in neat compartments, were clean linen bandages, a small brown bottle of carbolic, a jar of yellow salve, and a small tin of wild honey. "I brought this back from town," she said, indicating the honey. "It is better than any salve for keeping a burn clean, but this," she uncorked the carbolic, "will sting." She poured water from the canteen into a clean basin and dipped a cloth. She sat on the bench opposite him, the table the only thing between them. "Give me your arm." He extended his arm, resting it on the table. She began to clean the wound. Her touch was meticulous, efficient, and impossibly gentle. She worked with a clinical focus, cleaning away the layers of grime and ash, revealing the damaged skin beneath. Ward did not move. He did not flinch, not even when the carbolic stung. He simply watched her. He watched the intense concentration in her face, the way her brows furrowed slightly. He watched the way the firelight caught the reddish glints in her brown hair, strands of which had escaped her bun and now curled damply at her temple. He was silent, his gaze fixed on her, and he did not look away. She worked, her hands sure and practiced. But as she cleaned the last bit of ash from the tender skin of his wrist, her fingers, which had been so steady through fires and fights, trembled. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion, a betrayal of the calm she projected. But in the overloaded silence of the cabin, it was as loud as a gunshot. Ward saw it, his eyes, dark and unblinking, lifted from her hands to her face. She stopped. Her gaze met his. The small space between them, which had been the professional distance between nurse and patient, suddenly vanished. It was now filled with the sound of the light rain tapping on the patched roof, the smell of the fire, and the sudden, acute awareness of their shared breath. Their breaths seemed to mingle in the warm, close air of the kitchen. June's eyes dropped, her focus snapping back to the wound as if she had been burned herself. She spoke, but her voice was not the clear, commanding tone he was used to. It was a whisper, so low it barely carried across the table. "I hate this." He thought she meant the burn, the pain, the ruin of his ranch. "It is just wood. June, it can be rebuilt." "No," she said, her voice tight, strangled. She did not look up. "I hate this feeling. I hate being afraid every time you are out of my sight. I hate waiting for the sound of smoke. I hate the smell of it. I hate waiting for the sound of wagon wheels in the night, or men shouting in the alley." She finally looked up. Her eyes, usually so clear and resolute, were now shimmering with an unshed, furious vulnerability. "I hate what this is costing you, and I hate that I am the one who brought you into it. You did not bring me into this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Hollis Creed did. Silas Braddock did. But I am the witness. I am the key, and he knows it." He saw it then. Not just the widow who had buried a husband. Not just the town's unshakable merchant. He saw the field nurse who had seen too many men torn apart, and who was now watching it happen again. To him, his right hand, calloused and stained with soot, moved across the table. He did not touch her face, or her hand. He reached for her wrist, the one not holding the cloth. He turned it over, gently. On the pale, smooth skin of her inner wrist, there was a small, dark blue smudge, an ink stain. He knew it instantly. He had seen it that day on her porch, the mark from her ledger, from her pen, from the hours she spent teaching Pippa and Tam. A slow, tired smile touched the corners of his mouth, the first true expression of warmth that had crossed his face since the fire. He rubbed the ink smudge gently with his thumb. "The mark," he said, his voice rough with smoke and something else, something tender. "The mark of a woman who builds houses with letters." June's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes searched his, seeing not the defeated rancher, but the man who had turned his back to a wagon to shield a child. The man who had promised a town well. The man who saw the ink on her skin not as a stain, but as a sign of creation. She did not pull away. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, they leaned toward each other. The table between them was a chasm, and they were closing it. Their foreheads touched. They stopped there, eyes closed, just breathing. A silent, mutual surrender. It was a moment of profound, shared exhaustion. It was a moment of grace, the fight, the fire, the lawsuit. The entire hard, cruel world receded, leaving only the two of them in the small, warm circle of the lamplight. "June," he whispered, the name a prayer. She opened her eyes. His were open, watching her. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of two people clutching at each other in a storm. It was slow, and it was sure. It was a kiss of discovery, of finding the single solid point in a world that was tilting and burning. It tasted of smoke and coffee and the clean, metallic tang of the rain. It was a promise, held for longer than a single breath, a silent vow that they were no longer standing alone. His hand, the one that had touched the ink, moved from her wrist to her shoulder. His grip was firm, respectful, and steady. It was not the grasp of a lover, but the anchor of a partner. Her hands, the clean linen bandage falling unheeded from her grasp, rose. She did not clutch at him. She placed them on his back, her palms flat against the solid, tense muscles beneath his soot-stained shirt. She felt the strong, steady, reassuring beat of his heart. They pulled closer, a magnetic, undeniable draw. Her shawl, still damp from her ride, slipped from her shoulders and fell to the wooden chair, the small sound lost in the sound of the rain, which was now drumming more steadily on the cabin's patched roof. They pulled close, but they held there. This was not a moment of reckless abandon. It was a moment of quiet, profound connection. A line had been drawn, and they had crossed it. But they did so with a reverence that acknowledged the cost of the day. They broke the kiss slowly, their foreheads coming to rest together again. A small, shared, weary smile passed between them, a look that said everything that the chaos and the smoke had forbidden. "Your wrist," she murmured, her voice husky, her breath warm against his skin. "It can wait," he said. She finished the task. Her hands were steady now. She applied the honey and the salve, her touch firm, and wrapped the clean linen bandage around his arm. When she was done, Ward stood. He added another log to the fire from the small stack he kept inside. The flames leaped, a defiant orange, pushing the damp chill back into the corners. He looked at the bench, then at the small, worn rug before the hearth. He sat on the rug, his back against the warm stones, and held out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, June sat beside him. She took his hand. His fingers, rough and calloused, laced through hers, which were fine-boned but strong. June felt the last ounce of her strength ebb away, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She leaned her head, slowly, until it rested on his shoulder. It was solid. It was real. The tension that had held her spine rigid for 10 days, through threats and foreclosures and fires, finally released. The desire to simply stay, to not move, to not be the commander or the witness or the unshakable widow, was overwhelming. It was a craving, sharp and clear, but gentle. It was not a desire for passion. It was a longing for harbor. He felt the weight of her head on his shoulder, a trust he realized he had never been given by anyone. His arm, the uninjured one, came around her, holding her close, a simple, protective gesture that was as natural as breathing. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain. The cabin was warm, a small, safe island in a world that would resume its attack at sunrise. The fire burned low, the bright flames reduced to a bed of glowing, pulsing embers. A chill began to creep back into the room. Ward shifted, reaching for the simple wool blanket folded on his cot. He unfolded it carefully, shook out the small traces of dust, and draped it over her shoulders, tucking it around her. She looked up at him. Her eyes, in the dim, glowing light of the dying fire, were bright. They were not frightened. They were not defeated. They were peaceful. "Tomorrow," June said, her voice quiet but firm, resonating in the small space. "We fight." He nodded, his gaze steady on hers. He saw the strength he had first admired, but now he saw the woman who held it. She settled back against him, her hand tightening in his. "But tonight," she said, "is ours." The Larkspur Opera House had not seen opera in a decade. It was a cavernous, dusty hall with a proscenium arch painted with fading cherubs. Now, its velvet-covered seats were filled, not with ranchers in their Sunday best, but with every citizen who could fit. They crammed the aisles, they lined the back walls, they hung over the balcony railing. This was not a trial. It was a reckoning. Pike's public posting of the will, the ledger, and the map had done its work. The town was a powder keg, and Judge Greeley Tusk, a man whose gavel usually just echoed in an empty room, was sitting on top of it. At a heavy oak table to the right sat Silas Braddock, his face a mask of calm indifference. Beside him was his lawyer, a sharp man from the city named Finch. Behind them, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud, sat Edric Sloan. At a smaller, scarred table to the left sat Ward McKinnon, Norval Pike, and June Calloway. They looked small, isolated. "This court," Tusk began, his voice booming artificially in the large space, "is convened for a preliminary hearing on the matter of the estate of Hollis Creed." He shuffled papers, avoiding the hundreds of eyes fixed on him. "Mr. Pike, you have the floor, and I suggest you be brief." Norval Pike stood. He was not the rumpled man from the saloon. He wore a clean, pressed string tie. He was sober, his eyes sharp and bright. "We will be brief, Your Honor, as the truth often is," Pike said, his voice carrying easily to the balcony. "The deceased, Hollis Creed, left a will. It is legal. It is binding. And it leaves his estate to this man, Ward McKinnon." "A will," Finch scoffed. "That is a legal absurdity, a finder's keeper's inheritance. It's a joke." "A joke," Pike countered, "that you seem terrified of. We have the will, witnessed by myself. We have the testimony of Mrs. Calloway, who confirms the testator's state of mind. And we have the key to the claim. We call Parson Bramwell." The parson, looking profoundly uncomfortable, was sworn in. He identified his ledger. He identified Hollis Creed's signature. He read aloud, his voice trembling. The crucial line, "For services, pending CRAR compensation claim." "Thank you, Parson," Pike said. He knew he had a claim. Now, what does that claim? Pike unrolled the oilcloth map. He pinned it to a board. The original county survey, 1871. It places Mesquite Draw and the Slate Quarry squarely on Hollis Creed's land. The boundary is marked here. He tapped the paper. By Bell Rock. A quaint interpretation. Finch interrupted. My client, the Transcontinental Railroad, holds a federal grant and a survey conducted by certified professionals, which places the boundary half a mile south. A professional survey, Pike said. That is a forgery. He picked up a basin of water. But do not take my word for it. Let us ask Hollis Creed himself. He splashed the water across the map. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. As the water soaked the paper, a faint, ghostly image bloomed into view, pressed into the very fibers of the document. It was an intricate, unmistakable drawing of a bell-shaped rock formation. The watermark, Bell Rock. This is not just a map, Your Honor. Pike roared. This is the original county registration paper, the one Hollis Creed filed himself. The railroad's map is a lie. And this, he slapped the wet paper, is the proof. The crowd erupted. Tusk hammered his gavel. Order, order. Pike was not finished. I called June Calloway. June walked to the podium. She was steady. Her voice was clear, filling the theater. She told of nursing Hollis. She told of his fevered talk of surveyors. Finch stood. Mrs. Calloway, you are the sole condition of this will. Is it not true that you stand to gain, perhaps personally, from a relationship with the new heir? June's eyes flashed with cold fire. Ward started to rise, but Pike put a hand on his arm. I stand to gain, June said, her voice cutting. The satisfaction of seeing the law upheld. I am here as Hollis Creed asked, as a witness to his character. He was sane, he was sharp, and he was being robbed. Your opinion? Finch sneered. You have no proof he even knew that land, other than the ramblings of a sick man. He was not rambling, June said. She reached not for the will, but into her own reticule. She pulled out a single, folded piece of personal stationery. I kept this, Your Honor. I did not believe it was evidence, until now. It is a letter Hollis sent me after he recovered, thanking me. Objection, Finch shouted. Personal correspondence. It goes to the testator's state of mind, Your Honor. Pike countered smoothly. Tusk, his eyes fixed on the letter, waved a hand. Read it, Mrs. Calloway. June unfolded the paper. He writes, I will be back in the spring. When this railroad business is settled, I will show you the draw myself. The water runs fastest at the bend, just before the high pass. You will know the spot. There is a crack in the granite wall there, no wider than a man's hand. It looks just like a bird's throat, wide open, waiting for the rain. A profound hush fell over the room. This was not a legal boundary. This was a secret. June looked at Finch. Ask your professional surveyors. Mr. Finch, if their maps include the bird's throat crack, ask Mr. Sloan. It is a detail only the man who owned the land, who knew the land, would ever see. The crowd murmured. It was a blow, and Finch had no answer. Before Pike could rest his case, Ward McKinnon stood. Your Honor, Ward said, his voice rough, unused to such a setting. May I speak? Pike and June looked at him. Surprised, Tusk, sensing the crowd was with Ward, nodded. Ward did not go to the podium. He stood at his table, his hat in his hands. He was covered in soot, the bandage on his arm a stark white. He looked exactly like what he was, a burned-out rancher who had nothing left to lose. I am not a lawyer, he began, his voice low but carrying in the tense silence. I do not know about watermarks or compensation claims. I am here because I have a foreclosure notice on my ranch that says I have 8 days left. I am here because my barn was burned to the ground last night. A low growl came from the crowd. Sloan shifted, his hand moving near his coat. I am here, Ward continued, because of this will. But I want this room to know, I did not know Hollis Creed. I only knew him for 5 minutes. He was a stranger, dying in the dirt on my land. He looked at the crowd, at the faces of his neighbors. I did not hold his hand to get his property. I held his hand because he was a man, and he was alone, and he asked me to. That is all. He looked directly at Silas Braddock. There is no amount of money in your bank, Mr. Braddock, that can buy that, and there is no law you can write that can take it away. I did not ask for this, but Hollis Creed left me his fight, and I will not let go. He sat. The silence was absolute. It was no longer a hearing. It was a sermon. Judge Tusk was pale. He was trapped. The town, the evidence, and the moral high ground were all on one side. He looked desperately to Silas Braddock. Braddock, seeing his case evaporating, leaned forward and whispered in Tusk's ear. It was a short, sharp command. Tusk's face hardened. He cleared his throat, his official, imperious voice returning. While this testimony is moving, the court finds the very nature of this deathbed will to be highly suspect. The chain of evidence is irregular. I am therefore inclined to dismiss this claim as... Hold on. The great double doors of the opera house burst open. A dozen men stood there, their forms silhouetted against the bright morning light. They were not ranchers. They were covered in gray stone dust, their hands calloused, their shoulders broad from hard rock work. They were the quarrymen Hollis Creed had once employed, their leader. A barrel-chested man named Jeb marched down the center aisle, his heavy boots echoing. "Your Honor, this is a circus." Finch was on his feet, shouting, "I demand these men be removed. We are here to submit evidence," Jeb roared, his voice like a rock slide. He reached Tusk's bench and threw a thick sheaf of papers onto it. "We heard about the lawsuit. We heard about Bell Rock. We worked for Hollis. When the railroad blockaded the draw, we had to use the old high pass to haul stone. It cost us, but we managed." He turned and pointed a thick, dust-caked finger directly at Edric Sloan. "But last month, that man and his survey crew put up a new gate on the high pass, said it was railroad land. Two said we had to pay a toll." Sloan was on his feet, his face purple. "That is a lie." "Is it?" Jeb sneered. "We have receipts, you bastard." Judge Tusk picked up one of the papers, his hands shaking violently. He read it, his eyes wide in disbelief. He read it aloud, his voice cracking. "Received $20 for cargo passage. Mesquite High Trail. Signed, E. Sloan, Transcontinental Survey." The theater exploded. It was no longer about a will. It was no longer about a map. This was open, blatant, criminal extortion. Sloan, acting for the railroad, had been shaking down the quarrymen. The civil suit was now a criminal case. "Your Honor." Pike's voice cut through the din like a knife. "This is proof of a criminal conspiracy. We demand Mr. Sloan be taken into custody." Silas Braddock was ashen. This was out of his hands. His expert surveyor was a common thief. Sloan was a liability. He had failed. "Order!" Tusk screamed, smashing his gavel. But no one was listening. He looked at Braddock, who offered nothing. Tusk looked at the furious faces of the quarrymen, at the righteous anger of the ranchers. He saw his entire world collapsing. This court finds," he bellowed, his voice breaking, "that the evidence presented is substantial. The inheritance claim of Ward McKinnon will proceed to a full trial. All railroad work in the disputed territory is hereby frozen." "We demand an independent survey," Pike shouted, "overseen by a federal marshal." "Granted, granted," Tusk shrieked, desperate. "This hearing is adjourned for 48 hours to secure a marshal and an independent surveyor." Tusk fled the stage, his robes flying. The crowd surged forward, surrounding Ward and June, clapping them on the back, shaking their hands. It was a victory, but in the chaos. Ward looked past the cheering faces. By the side exit, he saw Braddock, his face no longer calm, but a mask of reptilian fury. He grabbed Edric Sloan's arm, hissing one. Sharp command. Sloan, his face dark with his own humiliation, looked across the sea of people. His eyes found June Calloway. He locked onto her, a look of chilling, personal promise. He gave a short, sharp nod to his employer. Braddock turned and vanished. Sloane, like a shadow, followed him. Ward grabbed June's arm. The celebration around them went cold. "It is not over," he said, his voice low. "I know," June said, her hand finding his, her knuckles white. "He just told Sloane to solve this before the surveyor gets here." The 48-hour clock was ticking. The independent surveyor and the federal marshal were on their way. But they were a day out. Braddock would not wait. He had lost in the court of public opinion. He had lost in the preliminary hearing, and his deadline was approaching. He had one move left, Pike Ward, and June knew it. The true target had always been June. She was the linchpin. Her testimony activated the will. Without her, Ward McKinnon was just another debtor, and the will was just paper. "He will come for you tonight, June," Pike said. They were gathered in the back room of the Mercantile, the children asleep on their cots, oblivious. "He has to stop you from being there when the marshal arrives." "He thinks I am the weak link," June said, her voice cold. The fire in Ward's barn had burned away her fear, replacing it with a hard, brittle anger. "He thinks I am a shopkeeper. He is about to learn that I am not." "He'll expect you to hide," Ward said, his eyes on the map. "He'll expect me to be with you." "We will do the opposite." The plan was simple. It was dangerous. And it relied entirely on Braddock's arrogance. "June, you will ride home," Ward said. "Back to the ranch, as you always do." "Ward, no," Pike interjected. "That's madness. It's painting a target on her." "She will be a target," Ward said, his voice low and steady. "And Sloane will be the arrow. But he will be so focused on the target, he will not see the trap." "Bitter Creek Bridge," June said, her eyes meeting Ward's. "It is the only crossing, narrow, dark, and isolated. It's where he'll do it." "Jeb and the quarrymen are already in the rocks above the pass," Ward said. "Gable and Davies are with them. They'll be watching. I'll shadow you, a quarter-mile back. When Sloane makes his move, I'll signal them." "A signal?" June asked. "Jeb has a mirror," Ward said. "Sloane won't be looking at the moon, but Jeb will be. He'll catch the light." June went to a high shelf and took down a heavy paper cone. "If he is going to stop my testimony," she said, her voice grim, "he is going to be marked by it." She tied the cone to her saddle. It was a full pound of fine, imported indigo dye. The moon was a high, cold sliver, casting weak light over the landscape. June rode Lark at a steady, unhurried pace. She did not look over her shoulder. She did not need to. She knew Ward was back there, a ghost in the shadows. She reached the mouth of the pass, the air growing colder, filled with the rush of the creek below. The wooden planks of the Bitter Creek Bridge were just visible ahead, a dark line across the water. As she expected, 3 riders emerged from the deep shadows of the cottonwoods. Edric Sloane, his face, in the faint moonlight, was a road map of bruises and hatred. He had 2 of his hardest railroad men with him. They fanned out, blocking the narrow path. "A late ride, Mrs. Calloway," Sloane sneered, his voice a low growl. "Lost your escort." June pulled Lark to a halt, her hand steady on the reins. "Let me pass." "Sloane." "Oh, I'll let you pass," he said, walking his horse closer. He looked like a wolf, confident, savoring the moment. "As soon as we've corrected the court record, it seems you were mistaken, confused, delirious, perhaps." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket and held them out, along with a pencil. "This is a simple affidavit, a retraction. You will sign it. It states that Hollis Creed was mad, that you and Pike manufactured the claim, that you pressured McKinnon, that the will is a fraud. Sign it." "I will not," June said, her voice ice. "The alternative," Sloane said, gesturing to the black, rushing water 20 feet below the bridge, "is so tragic. A woman, riding alone, her horse shies on the slick wood. A terrible accident. No one would blame you, but your testimony would die with you." He smiled. Sign it. June looked past him. Up at the high, dark ridge that formed the canyon wall, the moon was just clearing a bank of clouds. You are a fool, Sloane, she said, her voice clear and carrying. What did you call me? He snarled, his patience snapping. You and Braddock. You think this is about paper. You think you can burn barns and threaten women and win. I have the guns, Sloane said, moving toward her. I win. No, June said, her eyes still fixed on the ridge. Sloane looked at her, confused by her calm. What are you looking at? He turned and looked up. At that exact moment, high on the ridge, a pinpoint of light flashed. Once, twice, a small mirror, catching the moonlight. A bright, sudden spark in the darkness. Sloane's eyes widened. What the? It was the last word he got out. Now! Ward's voice roared from the rocks directly above them. The ambush was sprung. It was not a firefight. It was an avalanche. Jeb and the quarrymen, men who lived and worked in the rocks, swarmed down the embankment. They moved with a speed that defied the terrain. One of Sloane's men, startled, drew his gun, but before he could fire, a lariat, thrown by Jeb, snapped tight around his chest, dragging him clean from the saddle. The other man spurred his horse, turning to flee, only to be met by Gable and Davies, who tackled him like a steer. Sloane, trapped, did the only thing he could. He lunged, not at the ranchers, but at June. He grabbed her arm, trying to rip her from the saddle. You set me up, you bitch! He still held the false affidavit in his other hand. You want my mark, Sloane, June screamed, her voice high and piercing. Here it is. She had already untied the paper cone. As he grabbed for her, she smashed it, with all her strength, directly into his face and chest. The cone exploded in a choking, vibrant cloud. It was not dust. It was pure, fine, indigo dye. It filled his eyes, his mouth, his nose. It coated the front of his shirt. It covered his hands, which were still clutching the affidavit, turning the papers, and his skin. A deep, unmistakable, criminal blue. Sloane recoiled, blinded and choking, his hands clawing at his face. I can't see, I can't. Ward was on him. He leapt from the rocks, hitting the ground and launching himself at Sloane in one fluid, furious motion. He tackled him off his horse, and the two men crashed onto the slick, muddy approach to the bridge. Sloane scrambled up, blinded, panicked, but fueled by rage. He pulled a long skinning knife. He slashed wildly, the blue dye on his face making him look like a demon in the moonlight. You burned my home, Ward roared, his voice raw. He advanced onto the bridge. The bridge was a death trap. The rain from the previous night had left the old wooden planks slick with wet moss and mud. Below them, the bitter creek, swollen with runoff, was a black, roaring torrent. Sloane, though blinded, heard Ward's boots on the planks and lunged at the sound. Ward sidestepped the wild thrust. He didn't have a knife. He had his hands, hard from work and rage. He grabbed Sloane's wrist, the blue one, and twisted. The knife spun from Sloane's grasp, clattering onto the planks and skittering over the edge into the water. The two men stood, chests heaving. Sloane, seeing only shapes, lowered his head and charged like a bull. Ward met him. They collided. A brutal impact of bone and muscle. Their boots slipped. They grappled, sliding on the treacherous wood. Sloane was bigger, heavier, but Ward was grounded, driven by a cold, righteous fury. Sloane pushed Ward back, his boot catching on a warped plank. He twisted, trying to throw Ward over the side, but his footing was gone. His boot slipped out from under him. He pinwheeled, his arms flailing, and slammed hard against the low, rotten wooden railing. There was a sound of old wood snapping. Sloane screamed. A high, thin sound, cut short. He fell backward, his body disappearing into the darkness. Ward! June screamed from the bank. Ward threw himself flat onto the slick, wet wood. He shot his arm out, over the broken edge, his hand clamping down in the dark. He caught him. His fingers found a wrist. Sloane dangled, his entire dead weight hanging over the black, rushing water. He looked up, his face a pale oval, his eyes wide with stark terror. His blue hand was locked in Ward's grip. "Help! Me!" He choked. Ward's muscles screamed. The burn on his arm tore open. He looked down, not at Sloane, but at the blue hand he held. This was the hand that had lit the match. This was the hand that had demanded a false signature. "You are not dying tonight, Sloane," Ward ground out, his voice a low rasp. "You are not getting the easy way out. You are going to jail." Ward planted his boots, his arm shaking with the strain. "Jeb Gable on me now." The ranchers ran onto the bridge. They grabbed Ward's belt, his shoulders, and finally, Sloane's other arm. With a single collective groan of effort, they hauled the railroad man up, over the broken railing, and dumped him like a sack of wet feed onto the planks. Sloane lay there, gasping, sputtering, defeated, and he was undeniably, magnificently, blue. "Well, Mr. Sloane." A new voice cut through the night. It was crisp, female, and held absolute authority. "That's a peculiar color for a man's hands." Sheriff Maeve Durant stepped onto the bridge, her revolver held steady, but not pointed. She was flanked by 2 deputies. "Sheriff," Ward panted, getting to his feet. "McKinnon, Mrs. Calloway." She nodded. "I got your message. You said to be at the pass by midnight, that you expected trouble. Looks like you were right." She looked down at the sputtering Sloane, at his indigo-stained hands. "Edric Sloane, you are under arrest." "For what?" Sloane spat, finding his voice. "Defending myself. For arson, to start," Maeve said, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. "That fire at Willow Notch was suspicious, but this." She picked up the indigo-stained retraction papers from the mud. "Is coercion of a federal witness and forgery." She looked at his hands. "I'd say this is the strongest evidence I've ever seen. It's practically a signed confession." As her deputies hauled Sloane to his feet, Jeb called out from the bank, "Sheriff, you might want to check his saddlebag. He was mighty protective of it." Maeve walked to Sloane's horse. She unbuckled the bag, pulling out a small, neat leather ledger. She opened it, holding it up to her deputy's lantern. The townsfolk, woken by the sounds of the fight and the arrival of the law, had begun to gather, forming a silent, watchful crowd. Maeve read the entries aloud, her voice ringing in the cold night air. Item $500, flexible survey fees, mesquite draw. Item $200, public domain acquisitions. Item $1,000, obstruction removal, Willow Notch. A low, angry growl rose from the crowd. "And here," Maeve said, her voice dropping, "at the bottom of the page, authorizing the funds, a signature." She turned the book so the crowd could see the elegant, unmistakable script. Silas Braddock. The proof. The direct link. Braddock had paid for the arson. He had paid for the extortion. He had paid for Sloane to remove the obstruction. "That's our money," a voice yelled from the crowd. It was Mr. Gable. "He's been using our deposits at the bank to burn us out." "An audit," another voice cried. "We demand an audit of the bank now." The spell of fear over Larkspur Crossing was broken. The anger, long suppressed, was now a flood. Sheriff Durant led Sloane away, his blue hands cuffed behind his back, a walking symbol of Braddock's corruption. The crowd followed, a purposeful, angry mass, heading not for their homes, but for the bank. In the sudden quiet, June, who had been standing, rigid by her horse, finally let out her breath. A violent tremor ran through her. Her legs gave way, and she sagged against Lark's flank. Ward walked over to her. He didn't say a word. He took off his own canvas slicker, still smelling of pine and cold ash. He draped it over her shoulders. The coat was heavy, solid, and warm. She looked up at him, her face pale in the pre-dawn light. He was bruised, his arm bleeding again, but he was standing. He had held her hand, no longer trembling, found his. She laced her fingers through his, and she held on. Tight, they stood like that, hand in hand, as the first pale, impartial light of the new day began to gray the eastern sky. An hour later, as the sun rose, a wagon crested the rise. It was flanked by two men in federal uniforms, the marshal, and with him, the independent surveyor. They rode past the broken bridge, nodding grimly at the scene. They did not stop. They rode directly up the pass, toward the high canyon wall. They rode to Bell Rock. They spent 2 hours with their tripods and chains, the morning sun gleaming on their instruments. At 9 o'clock, the surveyor returned. He rode up to Ward and June, who were still waiting by the creek. He tipped his hat. "Mr. McKinnon, Mrs. Calloway, my survey is complete." "And?" Ward asked, his voice tight. "The watermark," the surveyor said, his voice flat and official. "Did not lie. Bell Rock is the legal and historical boundary. The railroad stakes are 1/2 mile onto Mr. Creed's and thus your property. Mesquite Draw was, and is, illegally occupied." The return to the Opera House 48 hours later was not a hearing. It was a formality. The room was just as packed, but the air was different. The fear was gone, replaced by a sharp, hungry anticipation. At the front, Judge Tusk sat at his bench, but he was a prop. Beside him, in a chair of equal height, sat Federal Marshal Elias Thorne, a man with a face like sun-baked granite and eyes that missed nothing. Silas Braddock was at his table, but he was alone. His city lawyer, Finch, had packed his bags and taken the morning stage. Edric Sloan was not present. He was in Sheriff Durant's jail. His hand still stained a faint, stubborn blue. Marshal Thorne called the court to order. "The independent survey is complete. The findings are unequivocal." He nodded to the surveyor, who stood. "Bell Rock is the boundary," the surveyor said, his voice flat. "The railroad's claim is fraudulent. Mesquite Draw, the slate quarry, and the adjacent stream known as Willow Notch Creek are, and have always been, private property, belonging to the deed filed by Hollis Creed." A roar of approval shook the dusty cherubs on the ceiling. Thorne did not gavel for silence. He let it ride. Norval Pike stood. "Marshal, in light of this, we demand the immediate enforcement of the will of Hollis Creed, and we demand full and punitive compensation from the Transcontinental Railroad for damages, theft of resources, and conspiracy to defraud." "And I," added Sheriff Durant, stepping forward from the back of the room, "present this ledger, recovered from Edric Sloan, detailing payments authorized by Mr. Silas Braddock for the express purpose of arson and the coercion of a federal witness." All eyes went to Braddock. He sat, immobile, his hands clasped on the table. He was a statue of a man, his mask of control perfect, even as his world dissolved. "The will," Marshal Thorne said, his voice cutting through the silence, "is found to be valid. The conditions, while unusual, were met. The testimony of Mrs. June Calloway, confirmed by the ledger of Parson Bramwell, is accepted. The court hereby recognizes Ward McKinnon as the sole and legal heir to the estate of Hollis Creed." The gavel came down. It was final. "Furthermore," Thorne continued, looking at the railroad's empty chair, "the Transcontinental Railroad is ordered to pay full compensation for the quarry's lost revenue, estimated at a sum that will be determined by federal auditors. They are to immediately restore the full and natural flow of the Mesquite Draw and Willow Notch Creek at their own expense. Failure to do so by noon tomorrow will result in the seizure of their equipment." A new sound filled the room. Laughter and applause. "As to the criminal matters," Thorne said, his eyes finally landing on Silas Braddock, "this court finds sufficient evidence to charge Mr. Braddock with conspiracy, arson, and fraud. A full federal audit of the Larkspur Bank will begin immediately. This institution is hereby placed under federal supervision." 2 deputies moved to stand behind Braddock's chair. His ruin was complete. The revenge, when it came, was not bloody. It was not enacted with a gun or a rope. It was enacted with ink and paper. 4 days later, Ward McKinnon walked out of the federal auditor's office with a bank draft in his hand. The initial compensation payment from the railroad was staggering. It was a number he could not truly comprehend. He was In an instant, the wealthiest man in the valley. He did not go to the saloon to celebrate. He did not ride out to his ruined ranch. He walked across the street to the Larkspur Bank. The doors were open, but a federal supervisor sat at the main desk. Not Silas. The ledgers, the ones Braddock had used as weapons, were now open on the counter. Mr. Gable was there, his hat in his hands, trying to plead with the supervisor for an extension. "I just need the interest, the 20%. It's—" "I cannot help you, Mr. Gable." The supervisor said, "The note is due." "I can," Ward said. Gable turned. Ward walked to the counter and placed the draft in front of the stunned supervisor. "I am here," Ward said, his voice quiet, "to pay some debts. Start with Mr. Gable's. How much?" The supervisor, nonplussed, checked the ledger. $800, plus interest. "Pay it," Ward said. "In full. Close the account." Gable stared, his mouth open. "Ward, I can't." "You did not ask," Ward said, turning to him. "You came with a bucket when my barn was on fire. This is not a gift. This is just neighbors." He turned back to the supervisor. "Who is next, Davies? The quarrymen find every small rancher's note in this book. Every loan Silas Braddock held at 20%. Pay them all. Today." For the next 2 hours, Ward stood at that counter, and with a stroke of a pen, he systematically dismantled Silas Braddock's empire of fear. He did not just free himself. He freed the entire valley. He did not shoot his enemy. He took away his power, his influence, and his victims, leaving him a hollow, ruined man facing a federal prison. The revenge was complete. 2 days later, June was in her mercantile. It was quiet. The children were drawing on a piece of slate. Norville Pike walked in, holding one final document from the will. "A small matter I overlooked, Mrs. Calloway," Pike said, a small smile on his face. "An addendum, from Hollis himself." He read from the paper. "To Mrs. June Calloway, who gave me shelter when I was sick, and who I trust as my witness. I know she does not accept charity. Therefore, I leave her a professional fee for her services, to be paid from my estate. It is to be the sum of $100, for the specific purchase of a sturdy new wagon, and all the books she can fit inside it. She will know what to do with them." June put her hand to her mouth, her eyes flooding with sudden, unexpected tears. He had remembered. The man she had thought half mad had seen her, had understood her promise. She bought the wagon that afternoon. It was bright red. She had Larkspur Traveling Library painted on the side. It was not just a bookstall. It was a classroom on wheels. Her first act of business, however, was for Pippa and Tam. She had sat with them the night before, the small boat Ward had whittled in her hand. They were not her children. She cared for them deeply, but she was a teacher, not a mother. She was about to be on the road, taking her library to every corner of the valley, and they, more than anyone, deserved a home. Mr. and Mrs. Gable, their ranch now free and clear, had been watching the children for weeks. Mrs. Gable, who had lost a child of her own to the fever, had a hollow in her life that matched theirs. June made the arrangement. It was not a sad parting. It was a secure, loving placement. She was not abandoning them. She was providing for them, giving them the one thing she could not, a family. She watched them walk into the Gables' farmhouse, Pippa holding her slate and Tam his broom. They did not look back. They were, for the first time, home. That evening, Ward found June in Pike's office. The lawyer had drawn up the last of the papers. The Dust Haven Community Well Fund, Pike read, is hereby established, endowed by Mr. Ward McKinnon. Ward slid the paper across the desk to June. It needs a co-signer, he said, a witness, to make sure the money always goes where it is intended. June took the pen. She looked at the top of the charter. Ward had added a line. It did not say Dust Haven Community Well Fund. It read, the Hollis Creed Memorial Fund, for the water of a free town. She looked at him. her eyes shining. She signed her name, her hand firm, her ink-stained fingers resting beside his. They were partners. The next night, the town gathered at Mesquite Draw. The railroad crew, under the watchful eye of Marshal Thorne, had dynamited their illegal dam. The sound of the explosion had been a cheer. Now, the water, clear and cold, was flowing again. It rushed down the draw, it filled the creek, and it poured, for the first time in months, into the cisterns at Willow Notch. It was a celebration. The ranchers, free of debt, had brought barrels of cider and roasted a steer. The quarrymen had brought their families. Lanterns were strung in the cottonwoods, their yellow light glowing like captured stars. A single banjo and a fiddle played a fast, joyful tune. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasted corn, and freedom. Ward stood on the porch of the Mercantile, which had become the center of the festival. He watched the town he had saved. June came out, carrying 2 cups of cider. She handed one to him. "You rebuilt your barn fast," she said, nodding toward the new-cut lumber she had seen at his ranch. "The whole valley rebuilt it," he said. "Gable brought the wood. Jeb and his men raised the frame in a day. I have neighbors." The banjo music softened, slowing to a waltz. He looked at her. Her face was flushed from the celebration, her eyes bright. He set his cup down. He did not bow. He did not ask formally. He just held out his hand, the one with the new, clean bandage. June looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she smiled, a slow, certain smile. She set her cup down and placed her hand in his. He led her to the clear space on the porch. His hand rested on her waist, his grip firm and respectful. Her hand rested on his shoulder. They danced. They were not graceful. He was a rancher, stiff from labor. She was a merchant, her movements precise, but they moved together. They moved as one. The noise of the party, the laughter, the fast fiddle tune, all of it faded away. There was only the sound of their boots shuffling on the wooden planks and the quiet space between them. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. In the chaos, they had been partners. In the fire, they had been allies. In the quiet of his cabin, they had been survivors. Now, under the light of the lanterns, with the sound of free water in the air, they were just a man and a woman. Their eyes, holding in the soft light, said everything that words no longer needed to. The smoke had cleared. The wind that swept down from the high passes no longer carried the scent of ash and ruin. It carried the clean, sharp smell of new-cut pine and damp earth. At the Willow Notch Ranch, a new barn stood, its frame raised in a single day by the combined labor of ranchers and quarrymen. But the true transformation was not the barn, it was the well. The drilling rig, paid for by the first installment of the compensation fund, had struck a deep, sweet aquifer. Now, a new windmill, not the old, groaning one, but a sturdy, new model turned rhythmically, pumping a steady, clear stream of water into a massive stone cistern. Ward was painting a sign. He was not a natural artist, but his letters were clear and strong. He nailed the new-cut plank to the cistern's frame. It did not say Willow Notch. It read, "The Hollis Creed Well, Water for All." The valley was changing. The water was flowing, and so was the ink. June's bright red wagon, pulled by her bay mare. Lark was a common sight, kicking up dust on the roads between the small, isolated ranches. The Larkspur Traveling Library had become the valley's new town square. She parked it in the shade of a cottonwood, and the children, Pippa and Tam among them, riding over from the Gable Ranch, would gather. They sat on blankets, their heads bent, learning their letters, sounding out the words that opened up the world. But the children were not her only students. Ranchers, men in their 40s and 50s, would approach the wagon, hats in hand. Men who had been forced to use an X to sign Braddock's crippling loan documents. They came to June, their faces set in grim determination, to learn to write their own names. They sat on the wagon's tailgate, their thick, calloused fingers struggling with the unfamiliar shape of a pencil, until they could proudly, legibly, sign the new, debt-free deeds that Norville Pike had filed for them. June was not just teaching reading. She was teaching independence. Ward, his work done for the day, was in his cabin. The foreclosure notice was gone from the door, replaced by a clean title, free and clear. He was cleaning, putting the last vestiges of the fight to rest. He picked up the stiff, blood-stained leather pouch that had started it all. He had never fully emptied it. He had taken the will, the maps. But now, he turned it upside down. Shaking it, 2 small items fell onto his table. The first was a folded, brittle piece of paper, separate from the will, which he had missed in his haste. He unfolded it. It was Hollis Creed's hand, the same cramped script from the parson's ledger. It was not a legal document. It was a note, to himself. It said, "Do not let your hand be empty, when there is another who needs to hold it." Ward stared at the words, the dying man's final philosophy. He looked at the second item. It was a ring. It was not gold, or silver, or set with any stone. It was a simple, thick band of dark, pitted iron. A working man's ring. Crude, solid, and unbreakable. He picked it up. It was heavy in his palm. He closed his hand around it and walked outside. The sun was setting. It was the same relentless, copper-colored sun that had illuminated his poverty. But now it seemed different. It was not an enemy. It was a benediction. The light spilled across the valley, turning the grasses of Mesquite Draw, now thick with new water, a deep, burnished gold. June was riding up the path, returning from her rounds. She saw him standing by the new cistern, saw the way he was watching the sky, and dismounted, walking to join him. They stood in silence for a moment, partners, watching the day end. The air was warm. "The Gables are good people," she said quietly. "Pippa read a whole page today, from the book about cities. You did a good thing, June." He said. He looked at her. Her face was softened by the twilight, the hard lines of the fight replaced by a quiet, earned peace. The ink smudge was still on her wrist. He opened his hand. The iron ring sat in his calloused palm. "I found this," he said, his voice low. "It was his Hollis's?" June looked at the simple, dark metal. She understood what it represented. Ward did not kneel. He did not make a grand speech. This was not a moment for poetry. It was a moment for truth. "I am not a rich man, June," he said, though the world now thought him one. "The money is for the town. The water is for the town. This ranch, this." He gusted to the new barn. "This is all I have. It is not much." He looked at her, his eyes steady, holding hers. "But it is a start, and I cannot go back to being alone on this land." He held out the ring. "You will never be alone here, June. I promise you that." June looked from his face to the ring, and her eyes, which had held back tears through fires and threats, suddenly shimmered. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that seemed to light the dusk. "I did not choose a rich man," she said, her voice soft. "I chose to stay. I chose the man who stood up." She did not hold out her finger. Instead, she reached into the collar of her dress and pulled out a thin, silver chain. It was the chain that had belonged to her late husband, the one she wore empty, as a memory. She took the heavy iron ring from Ward's hand and, with a steady, certain movement, threaded it onto the chain. She let it fall, the dark, humble iron resting against the silver. She tucked it back beneath her shirt, placing it against her skin. Over her heart, Ward's hand, the one that had held the ring, rose and gently touched her face. His thumb brushed the line of her jaw. He leaned in, and she met him. They kissed, and it was not the first tentative kiss of discovery in the storm-wrecked cabin. This was a kiss of knowing. It was deep, and it was slow, and it was certain. It was the seal on a promise that had already been kept. His arms, strong and sure, wrapped around her, pulling her close. Her hands came up, not to his back this time, but around his neck. her fingers lacing into his hair. They held each other, anchored against the vast, open prairie. Their breath mingled, warm in the cooling air, their shoulders pressed close. It was a kiss of profound warmth, of absolute respect, of two lives forged into one by a shared, unbreakable will. They did not need a church, or a judge, or a license. They had a promise, witnessed by the land itself. That night, down in the valley, the townsfolk lit lanterns. They did not hang them in the street. They walked, as a community, to the banks of Mesquite Draw. They lined the creek with light, a river of stars on the earth, to match the river of water that now flowed, free and clean. The sound of the water, no longer blocked, was a quiet, constant murmur, like the sound of justice, finally spoken. Ward and June, their arms around each other, sat on the porch step of the new cabin. They watched the lights from the valley below. The gable wagon pulled up. Dropping off the copy of the city book that Pippa had borrowed, the girl ran to Ward. "Mr. Ward," she said, her voice bright. "Tell us again. Tell us the story." Ward smiled, settling her onto the step beside him. "It is not much of a story, Pippa," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is just about a man named Hollis Creed. He was a man who had no one, and he was afraid of dying alone." June leaned her head against Ward's shoulder, her hand finding his. "So he wrote a will," Ward continued, his voice quiet, carrying on the wind. "He wanted to leave his land and his fight to the next person who was brave enough to hold a stranger's hand. He believed that a single handshake, a single promise to not let go, could sign the greatest will ever written, a will about how we are supposed to treat each other. And he was right." The cabin was quiet. The lantern on the post cast a warm, golden circle of light. June rested her head on Ward's shoulder, his arm securely around her, their hands laced together on the porch step. Before them was the dark, open prairie, no longer a threat, but a future. It was a future built not on gold or on railroads, but on the simple, powerful choice to stay, to hold on, and to promise, in the face of the storm, that they would never, ever be alone. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us your support by hitting the hype button, so this story can be heard by many more.